Plugging our cars into the mains electricity supply when we get home at night might currently seem about as natural as shoveling coal into them before setting off in the morning, but all the signs are that that's going to change. Hybrid cars were a first step in the direction of increased use of electricity to drive our vehicles, and fully electric models look like being the next. Owning a car that will never go near a filling station forecourt except to use the jet wash or inflate its tyres might take some getting used to, but Nissan is confident its Leaf can make the transition a painless one. We've long suspected that the days of the internal combustion engine were numbered, but a sensible formula for widespread use of its most obvious replacement, electric power, has long remained tantalisingly out of reach. In the earlier years of this century, electric cars were, after all, either wacky and impractical or so slow and power-thirsty that you hesitated to go further than to the shops and back in one, usually both. More recent, better designed electric cars from Mitsubishi, Peugeot and Citroën have improved in both these areas, but they've still been too small for the average family. What was needed was for one brand to take the bull by the horns and purpose design a decently sized electric car from scratch. Something with a conventional driving experience and family practicality. Something you didn't necessarily have to be an eco-warrior to own. Something like this, the European Car of the Year winning Nissan Leaf. Here's a brand that knows what it's talking about when it comes to electric power, with an EV history stretching all the way back to 1947. Only with the introduction of lithium-ion battery technology in the 1990s, though, did their EV development really take off. Suddenly, in theory at least, a future beckoned full of electric cars with decent operating ranges that could be produced relatively cheaply. But of course, in reality, it was never going to be that easy to produce such a thing. In fact, it's taken 2 decades for the technology to be perfected and for Western European public infrastructure to spring up and facilitate easy out and about charging. And even now, most manufacturers are still scratching their heads, but not at Nissan. In this Leaf, an acronym that stands for Leading Environmentally Friendly Affordable Family Car, we have, thanks to a £3 billion investment, the current state of the art when it comes to cars of this kind. A turning point in the motor industry as significant as the Model T or the Mini. This, we're promised, will be a game changer, the car that brings electric power into the mainstream, and we're going to try it. So, what will the future of motoring be like? Let's take a seat inside and find out. Behind the wheel here, it feels just like the Focus-sized family hatchback it is. But release the electronic parking brake and press the starter button, and the differences begin to become apparent. So you get that cheery chime, and then a bank of virtual instrument graphics spring up in front of you. You wait a few seconds, then you're ready to put the mouse-shaped gear selector into drive and set off. But before you do, take a look at the range indicator on the dash, designated by this bar graph and the mileage figure displayed as part of it. Now, it's the display you're going to get very used to staring at, because it'll determine exactly how and when you can use this car. Let's assume, though, that you're fully charged and ready to hit the road, as you will be doing at startling speed. It's the first thing everyone notices about this car. Come to it with electrical expectations based on milk floats and golf carts, and the way that 100% of the torque is available right off the bat never fails to surprise. Indeed, from rest to 30 miles an hour, this Leaf accelerates faster than a petrol V6, but progress slows as the revs rise, culminating in an 11.9 second rest to 60 mile an hour figure that's no better, but certainly no worse, than a rival conventionally powered diesel model. Power comes courtesy of a 360 volt electric motor, putting out the equivalent of 108 brake horsepower and a pokey 280 newton meters of torque, as this unit revs, rather promisingly, to over 10,000 RPM. It'll only manage 90 miles an hour flat out, but of course this car isn't built for outright speed. It is instead designed for people who travel less than 70 or 80 miles a day. That's over 80% of us, Nissan claims, and that's why this car can offer you a range of around 110 miles on a full battery charge, though it would be easy to almost halve that with lead-footed use. Around 7 to 8 miles from empty, a voice will prompt you to find a recharging point, just as a low charge turtle graphic appears here on the dash, and it's then the perspiration might start. Long motorway journeys will certainly be off the agenda unless owners are going to be making 12-hour coffee stops, that being the amount of time necessary to fully replenish the battery from empty, something you'll normally be doing, of course, overnight, plugged into your garage electricity supply, any normal 220 to 240 volt dedicated AC supply with a 13 amp 3-pin plug. In the future, when public quick charging points are installed all over the country at places like motorway service areas, then things will be different, and use of electric cars will then become far more flexible. Such a quick charging point can, after all, with a 400 volt 32 amp blast, replenish up to 80% of this Leaf's battery charge in just 30 minutes. Such quick charging points are installed at every one of Nissan's EV dealerships across the UK. One of the reasons why the Japanese brand reckons that over 90% of the British population is no more than 50 miles away from a quick charger. And there'll be quick charging points springing up in town centres across the UK as well in future years. But there are already charging points in many town centres based on a more conventional electricity supply, the kind that you'd have at home. And the idea is that you can plug the car in for a top-up while you go shopping. Now, this Leaf will direct you to your nearest charging point, as it's done for me here. Now, get a charge card like this from your local council, and you can use charging points like this as often as you want. The cards will cost anything from £50 upwards, depending on the council, but at least the electricity is often free, as sometimes is also parking. So you pull up, you swipe your card to open the flap, then you plug in, and you flip the flap on your Nissan Leaf. Now, something to remember is that many of these charge points aren't the quick charging ones that will top up 80% of your battery in just half an hour. Those are mainly at Nissan EV dealers, although they'll spring up around the country in much greater numbers in future years. So really what you're looking at here is a trickle charge that will just top up your battery while you go shopping. There are two socket points. One is for a quick charge, if you happen to find one, but it's the right-hand socket that you'll be using most commonly. This is the one I'll be plugging into at home on the mains supply overnight later on. So plug in, put the flap down, and go. It's as simple as that. So let's say I've done my shopping, or I've been to my business meeting, and I'm ready to go again. Simply unplug, and you're ready to trundle off in eerie silence into the urban environment that, of course, represents this car's preferred habitat. Actually, it's not quite silent. Let me show you what I mean. While designers of conventional cars bust a gut to keep noise levels down, Nissan has actually had to add sound to this one to counter public fears that quiet electric cars as they approach might unpleasantly surprise unwary pedestrians or the visually impaired. So there's a speaker in the engine bay that at speeds of under 15 miles an hour emits a low whine to warn the pavement bound of your impending arrival. those of a particularly nasty disposition can use the switch down here to switch it off. Within the city limits, it'll make most sense to drive the car in its eco mode, which you can flip into using the gear stick down here. Now, as the name suggests, this is the more frugal of the two driving modes on offer. It'll enable you to harvest more energy from regenerative braking and when you're cruising along, so improving your range by up to 10%, though at the expense of slight impairments to both throttle response and to air conditioning effectiveness. Out of town, where yes, your Leaf will feel quite at home, it'll make more sense to switch to the standard driving mode, in which form, as I keep saying, this car will feel just like any other Focus-sized family hatchback. Well, maybe not quite like the sharp handling Focus, but then few cars have less need to provide a dynamic driving experience than this Leaf. In the event, you'll find it rather predictably tuned towards comfort with a Supple Ride and rather over-assisted power steering, designed of course for wheel twirling urban use. Out on the open twisty roads, you might be surprised to find that turn-in is quite sharp, that there's plenty of grip and that there's decently controlled body roll thanks to a centre of gravity that's the same as Nissan's 370Z sports car and nearly perfect weight distribution front to rear. All of which will be reassuring should you find yourself having to throw range caution to the winds and push on a bit. Many of the electric cars we've seen in recent times have been based on conventional platforms, and that throws up problems in terms of packaging. The Leaf, on the other hand, was designed from the ground up as an all-electric car. And since, as an all-electric car, there was of course no need to put a bulky engine up front, it features a stubby nose with a sharply angled profile that gives it a kind of wedge look, and that aids the strong aerodynamic performance. Things get a little more bulbous around a rear end dominated by this kicked-up roofline and these gently curving rear lights, and of course notable for the complete absence of an exhaust pipe. There is of course a battery instead, which you won't find housed in the boot, but under the vehicle's floor, where it helps to contribute to the low centre of gravity that aids the handling so much. Alright, so the looks may be a little unorthodox, but I think that's appropriate with such a groundbreaking car. The quirkiest detail is probably the raised profile of these blue LED headlamps that are positioned to draw air away from the wing mirrors and so reduce road noise. Build quality, guaranteed to be the same whether the car you're looking at is assembled in Japan, the USA or here in the UK, seems good with wafer-thin shut lines. But the really important thing here is the overall size. At around 4.5 metres long, this is about the same size as a Ford Focus style family hatchback. So it is at last an electric car big enough for proper family use, sporting a sensible 1.5 tonne weight and with a boot uncluttered by the need to carry heavy banks of batteries. In fact, at 330 litres, the luggage bay is actually bigger than that of a Focus. It's only when you push forward the 60/40 split folding rear seats and notice the huge step up here necessary to house the lithium-ion power pack that there's any hint of spatial compromise. And sure enough, the total seats folded luggage area that you'd expect in an ordinary family hatch, which would usually be about 1100 litres, is here reduced to just 680 litres. But I can't see that unduly bothering too many potential buyers. They'll be more interested in the news that this rear bench can comfortably accommodate 3 adults on shorter journeys, 2 on longer ones, and a trio of kids all day long. Now, a more pleasing consequence of having all those batteries mounted centrally under the floor is a moderately high seating position at the wheel, where it'd be easier to get comfortable if said wheel was adjustable for rake, in and out, as well as just up and down. Sat here, you face an appropriately futuristically styled split-level dash with blue-tinted graphics that look pretty conventional until you peer closer and find that they're primarily aimed at advising you as to just how much further you can go before a charging top-up is needed. Which is pretty important since this varies all the time depending on your driving style and the prevailing road conditions. The graphics advise you of your success in regenerating electricity, and there's an eco indicator to display the status of electricity consumption, with little Tamagotchi-like trees growing on the display depending on how frugally you're driving. Further range information is provided by the various functions that reside on the large IT and telematics screen that you'll find in the middle of the center console, powered by a system that Nissan calls Car Wings. You'll get a 5-year subscription to it when you buy the car, and it's worth having, showing you as it can the radius you can travel from your current position on the charge you have left. Now, if that isn't sufficient, then using a standard satellite navigation system updated with live traffic information, Car Wings can direct you to the nearest public charge-up point where you can get a top-up in about 30 minutes that'll restore 80% of your battery life and almost certainly get you home. Via this setup, you can set your home PC or even your smartphone to monitor your state of charge and set charging functions that'll even email you when the battery's topped up and ready to go. And using the same telematics, you can even remotely set the car to warm itself up or cool itself down when parked, ready for your arrival. Now, if you're realistically and rather laudably trying to do your bit for green motoring and considering this Leaf as an alternative to something like this, a conventional diesel-powered, Focus-sized family hatchback class car, then your first reaction upon hearing of this Nissan's asking price of well over £30,000 might be one of mild shock. But hold on, don't walk away just yet. Let me try and put things in perspective. For a start, there's a £5,000 government subsidy to take off that, which will probably pitch the eventual asking price you'll be paying somewhere in the £25,000 to £30,000 bracket, depending on the options you choose. So only £3,000 to £4,000 more than this car, a top spec petrol or diesel Ford Focus, and that's a difference you could conceivably make back in a year or so in tax and fuel savings alone. Starting to look a bit more realistic now, isn't it? And it'd be even more so based on the kind of PCP finance agreement that most customers choose. Now, this kind of thing will see you paying only for the amount that your car depreciates over a preset ownership period. So on a typical 3-year ownership agreement, and these are only rough figures to give you an idea, but that kind of agreement would see you paying about £6,000 up front and then around £400 a month over the term. At the end, well, the final balance would only be payable if you wanted outright ownership, but that's unlikely. Typically, you'd just switch to a new PCP contract on a replacement vehicle. So let's assume that you've decided that you could afford a Leaf and you want to check out the alternatives. What are they? Well, there are basically 4 categories of car that you could consider. And the first may be the easiest for potential Nissan EV buyers to dismiss, that of other all-electric cars. Now, this segment includes 3 little city runabouts, all based on the same fundamental design: Mitsubishi's i-MiEV, Citroen's C0 and Peugeot's ION, and all of which are smaller, and although perhaps the styling of these 3 might be more appealing to some customers. If you do want a bigger all-electric car, then Renault's Fluence ZE shares much of this Leaf's technology. But here you've got the hassle of deciding whether you want to buy the car and lease the battery that powers it, or lease both. If, having considered the other all-electric options, you're still keen on this Nissan, you've then to pitch it against e-Rev or e-REV models, cars like Vauxhall's Ampera or Chevrolet's Volt, that you could buy on the same kind of budget. The acronym, by the way, standing for extended range electric vehicles. So what are they? Well, cars that, as well as an electric motor, incorporate a small petrol engine that kicks in on an emergency basis only when the battery runs out of range. Sounds a good idea, doesn't it? But there are drawbacks here as well. The first isn't too big a one. It's a £3,000 premium in the asking price, so that might be a factor for you. But the bigger issue is the fact that instead of the 110-mile range that you get in this Leaf, the battery range of an e-REV model falls to just 30 to 50 miles, which means that you're going to be probably running for a rather large amount of the time on petrol power, which would seem to me to kind of defeat the point of buying a vehicle like this in the first place. The other two conceivable options for potential Leaf buyers are rather more conventional ones. Petrol-electric hybrids of similar size to this car, Honda's Insight, Toyota's Auris HSD and Prius, and Lexus's CT200H can cost anything between £17,000 and £30,000, depending on the model and the spec that you choose. But all will cost you more in tax, maintenance, and of course fuel, negating any saving over this Nissan within a few years. The same argument almost identically applies to ordinary diesel rivals, even so-called eco-special diesel models, cars like Volkswagen's Golf, TDI Blue Motion, Ford's Focus TDCi Econetic, or Vauxhall's Astra CDTi EcoFlex, for example. If you have carefully considered all of the many options and decided to buy a Leaf from one of the very limited number of Nissan EV UK dealers, the locations of which you can find by going on to www.nissan.co.uk/Leaf, then at least you won't be further burdened by having to trawl through a complicated model range. There's only one highly specified model that comes complete with air conditioning, 16-inch alloy wheels, rear privacy glass, front fog lamps, electric folding mirrors, cruise control, a colour reversing parking camera, auto wipers, Bluetooth compatibility for your mobile phone, a compartment in which you can store your sunglasses, and a decent quality MP3 compatible CD stereo with steering wheel controls and ports for AUX and USB functions. You also get a 5-year subscription to Nissan's useful Car Wings telematics system, which displays all kinds of useful range information on the car's center console information screen. It'll also direct you to the nearest charging point, and it'll even allow you to check on or activate charging remotely via your PC or your smartphone. Safety kit runs to ESP stability control, the usual electronic braking and traction aids, 6 airbags, and Isofix child seat fastenings. As for options, well, there are only a handful of those and all seem pretty important to me. Maybe not the pearlescent paint or the carpet mats, but certainly the rear parking sensors and the rear spoiler that I have here that incorporates space-age solar cells to further boost the 12-volt battery provided to power ancillaries. And a must-have for an extra £1,000 is Nissan's 240-volt 16-amp charging box, installable by British Gas or Scottish Gas, which bolts into your home electricity supply and reduces the overnight charging time from up to 12 hours to a much more reasonable 8 hours. Assuming you can afford the upfront asking price, then cost of ownership is another area where this Nissan shows up very well indeed. The phrase no-brainer springs to mind, and here's why. Let's start with the area that'll potentially save its owners the most money, which has absolutely nothing to do with fuel and everything to do with the fact that this car attracts no benefit-in-kind company car tax. Now that could potentially save owners thousands of pounds every year. Let's say, for example, that I switched to this car from a comparably sized diesel rival, say a Vauxhall Astra 2-litre CDTi SE Auto. The tax saving that I'd get from running a Nissan Leaf would equate to having around £300 extra in my pay packet every month. That's like being given a salary increase of £3,600 a year. In fact, it'd be better than that, since I wouldn't have to pay for a road tax disc. My maintenance costs would be about 15% lower, fewer moving parts, you see. I wouldn't have to pay the London congestion charge, and I'd even get free parking in some cities. And we haven't even got to the fuel savings yet, which the AA reckon would enable you to recoup the extra upfront asking price you'd paid for this car over a normal turbodiesel rival in under 3 years. Nissan reckons that on a typical annual mileage of about 9,300 miles, you'd save about £800 in fuel costs over an ordinary turbodiesel rival. If you want me to break that down, you're looking at about 3 pence per mile to run a Nissan Leaf, as opposed to about 11 pence per mile to run a conventional turbo diesel family hatch. And before you ask, yes, that does take account of the higher home electricity charges you'd incur by running this Nissan. The Japanese brand reckons that it'll cost you about £2 every time you charge this car up from 0 to its maximum operating range of 110 miles. In fact, you might get a bit more mileage out of it than that if you habitually drive the car in this eco mode and make full use of the regenerative braking. In terms of monthly electricity charges, expect this car to add about £25 on your monthly home electricity bill, which most will very happily pay in return for foregoing the £145 they would normally spend in fueling a conventional petrol or diesel motor over the same kind of period. And what about the green issues? Nissan's claim that this car emits zero CO2 is of course rather contentious, given that the vehicle is drawing power from the national grid, which some rather negative commentators have suggested equates to a CO2 reading of around 80 grams per kilometre. Now, I wouldn't go that far. Yes, you can debate this car's green credentials, but what you can't argue with is that all electric power is, right now, by far the most environmentally friendly source of automotive power. And you can also tell your green-bearded friends that 100% of this car's vehicle weight is recyclable. As for the other issues you'll need to be aware of when running a Leaf, well, the first thing you'll need to know is that not every Nissan dealership can service the thing. By the end of 2011, the Japanese brand had appointed just 32 EV dealerships across the UK, though the number is growing all the time. Nevertheless, it might be an issue for you if your nearest stockist isn't close. What else? Insurance, that's at Group 22, which is pretty par for the course in the Focus-sized family hatchback class. Battery longevity? Well, it is true that after 5 years, the battery in this Leaf will be down to about 80% of its original capacity. But then, by that time, most owners will probably have traded in their vehicle for another one anyway. But this might affect resale values. In fact, it probably will, so bear that in mind. Also remember that after 5 years you'll have to renew and pay to renew your membership of the clever Carwings telematics system that drives much of the useful driver information software in this model. Warranty, you get the usual 3 years or 60,000 miles of cover for all the standard bits, and that's extended to 5 years and 60,000 miles for all the electrical items, including the lithium-ion battery. If anyone would have told me a few years ago that I'd be recommending you seriously consider buying a Focus-sized family hatchback 25% pricier than its rivals, yet unable to travel more than 100 miles before needing to be left stationary for hours, I'd have laughed. But here I am suggesting you do exactly that. Critics can moan about the limited range, but I don't think it's an issue. Do they seriously think that anyone able to spend £25,000 to £30,000 on a car of this kind will hail from a single car household? Of course not. Likely Leaf buyers will be considering this vehicle as a second or even third car for short run use. I'll wager though that once they get one on the driveway, they'll be using it 80% of the time. This, the first mainstream pure electric vehicle on sale to the mass market, won't be for everyone, of course. Those without a garage or with regular long distances to travel will join single car families in dismissing this Leaf out of hand. But then, no car is for everyone. As the Japanese brand points out, you wouldn't buy a GTR supercar for family use or a Pathfinder SUV as a city runaround. Where Nissan has succeeded though is in finally bringing us an electric car free of compromise, a car you could pretty painlessly switch into from something conventional. Is this then a defining moment in automotive history? It certainly feels like it.